Good evening, friends. Here are some remarks about the lectionary readings we'll be doing for the period of September 25th to October 1st. One set of readings comes from the prophet Hosea. Hosea was an 8th century BC prophet in Israel. His time of activity was during the period leading up to the fall of the northern kingdom and the exile of the people to Babylon, which occurred in 722 BC. Hosea frequently refers to the northern kingdom by the name Ephraim, which is the name of one of the northern tribes of Israel. So that may be a helpful piece of information as you read through the text. The theme of Hosea from start to finish really is Israel's unfaithfulness and God's anger and judgment against Israel for their unfaithfulness and betrayal, but then finally God's undying love and firm commitment to remain faithful to the covenant, even with this unfaithful people. That is symbolized in a very vivid way, especially in the first 3 chapters of the book, by an account of the prophet Hosea's marriage at the command of God to an unfaithful woman, a prostitute named Gomer. And this story, whether historically factual or not, powerfully symbolizes both Israel's betrayal and infidelity and God's ultimate faithfulness. After those first 3 chapters, the remainder of the book is a collection of various oracles that oscillate back and forth between God's fierce, angry judgment against the unfaithful people Israel, but then swing back again and again to the theme of hope and God's ultimate compassion. You see this particularly at the beginning of chapter 6 and in the remarkable passage in chapter 11 of Hosea, which is one of the most heart-rending and moving pictures of God's compassion towards Israel like a wayward child. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. And then in verses 8 and 9, God's moving declaration, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over? My heart recoils within me, my compassion grows warm and tender. A really remarkable depiction of God's passionate love for his people. A second set of readings come from the book of Acts. This is a continuation of the story we've been reading. It opens with Paul's farewell speech to the group of elders in the city of Ephesus as he prepares to go to Jerusalem in the midst of impending foreshadowing of his ultimate arrest and suffering after he arrives in Jerusalem. The speech is full of words of warning that Paul anticipates that in the days to come there will be wolves, as he puts it, savage wolves who will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And it's a warning to the Ephesian elders to keep the faith in the midst of adversity. And this is emphasized again when the prophet Agabus appears in chapter 21 and prophesies that Paul is ultimately going to be bound and taken captive when he goes to Jerusalem. And Paul, of course, persists in his intention to go ahead to Jerusalem. So the themes we've seen before in the previous chapters of Acts continue here, that discipleship can be a matter of costliness and real danger. You might ask yourself as you read these chapters, in what ways is our faith costly? In what ways might God be calling us to serve the mission in a way that could put our own lives or our own security in various ways in jeopardy? The theme that we've seen before of Paul's networking with other Christians throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, of course, also continues to be a prominent theme here as Paul travels toward Jerusalem and touches base with various people on his way, and then finds believers as he returns to Jerusalem who welcome him there and counsel him in various ways. In those speeches, of course, Paul insists on his own Jewish background, his faithfulness to the law. This is after he's arrested as a result of mob protest. He insists that he is a Torah-observant Jew and that his dramatic conversion to faith in Jesus as Lord is not a betrayal of that Jewish background, but a continuation of faithfulness to the one God. Of course, the story takes a dramatic turn at the end of the section we're reading this week as Paul appeals to his Roman citizenship, which then drives the plot towards his ultimate journey under arrest to the city of Rome, which is where the book of Acts will end. The readings from the Gospel come from Luke chapters 5 and 6, many different stories here, but I would say that throughout chapter 5, particularly, the emphasis is placed very strongly on Jesus' authority. This shows up in various ways. It shows up in his miracle that he performs of telling the disciples to go out and produce the miraculous catch of fish, his authority to forgive sins, his authority to heal on the Sabbath, and indeed his declaration that he is Lord of the Sabbath, and that's why he has that authority. So look for that theme through all of these stories. But of course there's also there the theme of call, the calling of the disciples. One of the interesting puzzles is that this story about the miraculous catch that opens chapter 5 closely parallels a similar story at the very end of the Gospel of John, where it's a resurrection appearance narrative. And we're left a bit to puzzle over whether John has taken a tradition that originally was near the beginning of Jesus' ministry as a call narrative for the disciples and turned it into a resurrection story, or whether Luke has taken a tradition about Jesus' resurrection and reshaped it into a story of something that happens at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry to signal his remarkable authority. Notice that when Peter says, "Depart from me, for I'm a man of unclean lips," in that story, it is reminiscent of the call story of the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 6, where he also declares himself unworthy because he is a person of unclean lips. This suggests that Peter's encounter with Jesus is analogous to the prophet Isaiah's vision of God in the heavenly throne room. Really quite an extraordinary parallel. The latter part of the reading in Luke chapter 6 gives us Luke's Sermon on the Plain. Interestingly, in Luke, it's not a Sermon on the Mount, but it says Jesus comes down to a level place to deliver this sermon. Many of the things here in Luke 6 are closely parallel to what we find in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, although they're somewhat abbreviated. But there are a couple of distinctive emphases that I'd just like to point out for your attention. One is that Luke's version of the Beatitudes is much briefer than Matthew's, and it focuses very strongly on the theme of the danger of wealth and the blessing that's pronounced on poverty. Whereas in Matthew, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," Luke says, "Blessed are you who are poor." Whereas Matthew says, "Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." In Luke, Jesus says, "Blessed are you who are hungry now," and so on. And then Luke flips it over and pronounces woes on those who are rich and satisfied now. So that theme of warning on wealth, which is closely parallel to Mary's song, the Magnificat, in the beginning of Luke's Gospel, is continued here. And lastly, Luke emphasizes the theme of mercy. In Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." But in Luke 6:36, we find Jesus saying, "Be merciful just as your Father is merciful." That perhaps completes the circle back to the prophet Hosea, where Hosea is emphasizing God's undying love and mercy, and the same theme is picked up in a very explicit way here by Luke in the Sermon on the Plain. Hope these readings will be a blessing to you. Look forward to seeing you soon. Grace and peace.